Welcome to Literacy Talks, the podcast for literacy leaders and champions everywhere, brought to you by Reading Horizons. Literacy Talks is the place to discover new ideas, trends, insights, and practical strategies for helping all learners reach reading proficiency. Our hosts are Stacy Hurst, a professor at Southern Utah University and Chief Academic Advisor for Reading Horizons, Donnell Pons, a recognized expert and advocate in literacy, dyslexia, and special education, and Lindsay Kemeny, an elementary classroom teacher, author, and speaker. Now, let's talk literacy.
So my guest today is someone that I think you'll really enjoy hearing from. And we've been having many conversations about dyslexia, different aspects of dyslexia. Today might be really interesting for some because this is a conversation I'm not used to having with academics who are really involved in understanding and knowing about dyslexia and being open with those conversations. So I think this is going to be a very enjoyable conversation. Today I'm being joined by Dr. Jeffrey Conger. He's a professor with the School of Arts at Montana State University. And, Jeffrey, I'm just going to dive right into the conversation and kind of let it unveil itself. But I was surprised when I went on to the homepage at Montana State University to look at your credentials and look at your background. And right there, you state clearly, I have dyslexia, which is not something I'm used to having academics do. So tell me a little bit about that.
Well, just thank you for the invitation to join. Just full disclosure, I'm a full professor, 3 advanced degrees, and I still can't spell receive, right? So, we just have to get that out of the way where spelling is just one pathway to understanding. And that's in education, we have to figure out how to get at understanding in the best and most efficient way. In Montana, we're still a frontier state. Right. And so when we're classified as education. And so when you think about that, there's rural states and then there's frontier states. And we're still hovering around that 1 million people. We still have over 50 one-room schoolhouses in Montana. We have 2 amazing flagship institutions. But I'm from Idaho and literally grew up down the road from Chicken Dinner Road. Right. So that's just some context. And for me growing up, dyslexia, it wasn't even part of the conversation, right? And so I'm from the generation we white knuckled it through. We created our own workarounds, and we made our way, right? If we wanted to succeed. So that's just a little bit of my background, and just a little bit about Montana.
Yeah. Jeffrey, okay, I really want to hang out here for a second with your background because I know we're missing a lot in between that white knuckling. There are many folks, as we've been going along, we've been chatting with people and they've been talking about their own experience. And there's a lot that goes into going from, yes, reading is difficult to how am I going to make a future for myself? So you paint a picture for us in Idaho because you've also helped us to understand in some places, maybe you have the benefit of information, but in other places you really don't. So you're struggling with reading. It's difficult and there's no one around to say, hey, I know what this is and how to help you. What are you doing in your community? How did you come to know? How did you come to go to a university?
Well, like anything, it all starts with understanding. And it doesn't matter what your learning difference is, right? If it's, in my case, it's dyslexia, maybe it's ADHD, maybe it's something else. But it first starts with understanding. And then after the understanding, and that comes through the individual understanding it, and maybe the parent understanding it, then you get ownership, right? And only then once you have ownership of it, realizing what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, then you can create action, right? And so you really have to do all 3 of those steps. And we all come to it at different points in the game, right? And so I didn't realize I was identified as dyslexic until graduate school, right? So in my mid-20s, right? And so I had already navigated K through 12, and then also undergraduate, and then in graduate school. But we all need champions, right? So I'm gonna shout out to my 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Shepard, right? And she could see that I was struggling to learn to read and decoding. Decoding wasn't even a phrase then, right? And so she can see the outcome is I'm having a hard time with reading, and that's the number one indicator of dyslexia, as on the weakness side. We'll talk a lot about the strengths. So she's like, she pulled my parents aside and they said, maybe Jeff would really benefit from a picture dictionary, something that had the words and the pictures together. And I remember she said, well, this isn't going to be covered by the school district, and it's something that the family needs to cover. And let's say it was $20. Well, $20 back that time was $200 now. And my dad just looked at the teacher and said, "Are you sure we need this?" Right. And, he, bless his heart, he, took $20 out of his hard-earned paycheck and bought me a picture dictionary. And, that was the first. But even then, dyslexia there was no screening for dyslexia or whatnot. I was fortunate to go to a state institution, land-grant institution in Idaho, and I'm a big believer in land-grant institutions because there's so much opportunity and it's access for the sons and daughters of the working class. And I was fortunate to get 2 undergraduate degrees. Basically, what I did is, like many with learning differences, I created my own workaround, right? And so I took 12 credits a semester, because I knew that if in a core class, if reading, most people took an hour to read a chapter, it took me 3 hours to read a chapter. And so I just had to pace myself. So it took me 5 years to get a 4-year degree. But in that time, I used that wisely. And I got 2 degrees in 5 years, and one in education and one in graphic design. And here I am today, teaching graphic design. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I love hearing this. And I really want people to think about this, because we've had a conversation with my husband who has dyslexia. Mm-hmm. And he remembers, Jeff, the day that he drove off the campus here locally. He was on the dean's list at the time, but he was working so hard, he couldn't imagine continuing to do that work at that level. And so he drove off the campus thinking maybe one day he would return, and he never did. It's one of the biggest regrets. He still talks about it to this day, that he didn't go back to the campus. Yeah. I love hearing you talk about developing your own workarounds and the kinds of opportunities that were provided for you, right? The places that you could go.
Right. Well, and the thing is with dyslexia, we know from, dyslexia, it's equal opportunity. It loves everyone. It doesn't matter what gender or age or, it doesn't matter your nationality. It loves 20% of the world, right? And so in education, we've done a really good job figuring out how to teach 80% of those people, right? 80% of the masses. We're still figuring out how to teach those that have learning differences or are neurodivergent, right? And so that's where this century is really going to grow. Is we're going to figure out at both the K through 12 and higher ed level, how to better get at understanding for that 20% or larger percent of the population.
Yeah. Oh, that's such an excellent point. Jeff, I am very curious about that picture dictionary. Did it help that much?
Well, like many dyslexics, one of their superpower is visual memory. Right. And so there's so many strengths with dyslexia. One is big picture thinking and seeing patterns, more peripheral. There's some emerging research that talks about more peripheral vision because of the rods and cones in the eye. But for me, visual memory has always been very, very strong, right? Very strong. And this is common with a lot of dyslexics. And so just seeing the picture, and that helped with the decoding, right? Because we have those 3 points. One is breaking down the word, then is sounding it out, and then associating it to a meaning. So there's really 3 things or more going on when we're trying to decode it. And that's why with young, if there's any parents out there listening, just that idea of building vocabulary for children in the early years, you don't necessarily need to rely on eye reading to build vocabulary. And so that's where things like audiobooks are so powerful, is you can build that verbal and mental vocabulary And then if you need to work on the eye reading or the decoding of words later, that's fine. But you can still, with a child, build vocabulary through, little things like Playaway and Audible. There's so many great devices out there that in this digital realm that are positive.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point that you make, Jeff. And, my son who has dyslexia, obviously, there's a heritable component, so you're going to have dyslexia.
Yeah.
And my son who has a good solid case, we call him the good solid case of dyslexia. One of the things that he loved to do, because very visual again, and he loved the richness of the story, because he could really create in his mind the idea of the story. And so we would buy him reams of stacks of 8 by 11 sheets of paper, and he would create things in his room, third grade, fourth grade, and he would create the things that he pictured in his mind from the stories that we were telling. So I love you talking about leaning into those strengths as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. And, there's so many of them. I mean, I can't envision. I mean, now I have this, I'll call it a label, right? Diagnosis, identification, whatever, dyslexia, which means word blindness, right? But, that's the other part of the 21st century is we're going to look at those strengths of the dyslexic mind and the superpowers, because, as we start to understand it better with thermal mapping of the brain, we can see how the brain processes visuals at a faster pace and how that cognition works. And, I'm just really excited for the next 20 years as some of that research and understanding comes into life.
Yeah. And Jeff, it's good to emphasize that balance in how we look at ourselves and others, right? And balancing out, this may be difficult, but what else is this person completely capable of that I haven't thought about, right? And the school system doing that as well. So interesting.
Well, the school system, but also too remembering that starts at home, right? And
true.
so I get a lot of calls from parents, especially across the state, because I'm an educator, and I put that out there to assist in any way. And so a lot of times I will help parents and I'll say, okay, right. So your child's been identified with this learning difference, and we're basically going to spend X amount of hours a week trying to assist with decoding, which is always going to be a challenge, right? That's never going to go away, right? There's not going to be a magic wand. It's going to get easier, but it's always going to be there. So what, on the other hand, are we going to do to develop these strengths, right? If you're spending 8 hours a week working on building the decoding muscle, what are you doing 8 hours a week to build the strength muscle, whether that be creativity or whether that be athletics or whether that be music or whether that be something that they excel in, right? And finding out, doing that deep dive as a parent, finding out that area of interest and support it at the same level that you're supporting navigating the weakness, you're going to invest in those strengths. And so maybe your child is really good, like riding a horse. Wow. How can we incorporate that into that motivational and dimensional space? Because one of the things we look at, right? So it's pretty much the accepted percentage is 20% or 1 in 4 of general population is dyslexic. And then I work in the creative industry. And because of those visual strengths that are prevalent within the dyslexic mind, we jump up to at least 25% in graphic design. Then when we start looking at architects, that jumps up even higher. Then when we start looking at athletes, it jumps up even higher because that spatial understanding, that 3D. I would love, and I challenge anybody out there that's a researcher to do some testing of the X game athletes. This is a Jeffism, but I'm thinking it's over 50% dyslexic. I challenge anybody out there that's a researcher to jump on this and test the X game athletes and find out what is the percentage of dyslexia in an X game gold medalist, right? I think that would be a fascinating research topic or paper.
Jeff, you bring up something so interesting because it reminds me of my husband, who is also a paraglider, an expert mountain biker.
Yep.
And he always talks about when he reaches the top of a peak and they're setting up as paragliders to go off that peak as they're having a conversation, he meets somebody with dyslexia almost every time he's at the top of a peak, which I think is really interesting. And one of the things he said about it with paragliding is he said, that's when there are no limitations because it's on me. I have to do I don't have to read something. It's all on me to know this thing and to know it well. I think that's really interesting.
Well, and I come back to this idea, which is we start, a lot of times when we're doing advising, everyone's like, what kind of job can I have as a dyslexic, right? So let's take this paragliding. I would say that that's a natural ability, that spatial ability to move through the 3D, and I would even call that moving through 4D, right, with time. And so let's call that a pilot, right? And how many different pilots do we have, right? Obviously, we have, the classics in our brain, which are, a commercial pilot or maybe someone in the military. But then I start thinking about other types of pilots, right? Adventurers or race car drivers. Like, so Lewis Hamilton, who drives for Mercedes in Formula One, I think he has 7 world championships, right? So it's hard enough just to get one world champion. He's done it 7 times. Severe dyslexic, right? Mm-hmm. But at 200 miles an hour, navigating through the streets of Monaco, boom, boom, boom. It's just like the magic comes alive. And so that's the message that we need to hear in concert with developing areas of, hey, how do I navigate this other part that might be a weakness?
Educators and administrators know how important it is to close the gaps in foundational literacy skills for older learners. Reading Horizons Elevate is designed to help students in grades 4 through 12 and beyond master foundational skills they may have missed. By combining direct instruction with engaging, age-appropriate software, Reading Horizons Elevate makes reading proficiency attainable for older learners. Helping students build a strong literacy foundation is key to unlocking success across all academic subjects. Visit readinghorizons.com/elevate to learn more.
Jeff, I just love this conversation. It's going to lead us right into what you're doing at Montana State University about dyslexia and innovation and hosting a conference. Tell us how that got started and what it does.
Yeah, so Dr. Sarah Pennington and myself are co-founders of the Dyslexia and Innovation Symposium hosted here at MSU, and it's in its 3rd year. We did the first year in person, and then, of course, COVID pushed us online, and that was the silver lining. We went from having 300 participants the first year to 600 the second year to 900 the 3rd year. And all across we had, I think, 42 of the 50 states. We had 40 of the 56 counties. We had 6 countries. So there's need for this conversation. And so this is a collaboration between Dr. Pennington and myself. It's also a collaboration between our 2 colleges. So she's in the College of Education, EHHD, Education, Health, and Human Development. And I'm in the College of Arts and Architecture. And so when those 2 worlds collide, then some new thought comes out of the process. And so I'm the lifetime dyslexic. She's the educator teaching the teachers and working on curriculum for the future. And through that conversation, we created the symposium. And like any initiative or something, you need some champions. You need some people cheerleading for you. And so I'll tell you a quick little story. It was probably a few years ago. It was before the symposium got started, and I got an email from our university president, Waded Cruzado, amazing president. And I actually got an email from her assistant saying the president would like to see you as soon as possible. Well, it's like, okay, all right. And, we've been having some challenges in our department. And so I spent all night. I had 2 or 3 yellow pads thinking about what we were going to talk about, because it was a little elusive. She just said, I need to meet with you immediately. So I went in, and the president, wonderful, there's the 3 minutes of niceties at the beginning of the conversation. How are your family? How are you doing? We got done with the niceties, and all of a sudden, the president leans forward and And she says to me, she says, Jeffrey, have you thought about your future here at Montana State University? Oh my God. In the back of my mind, I thought the worst, right? I like, this is not a good way to start a conversation. And there's only been 3 times in my life where I've answered with the right response. And this was one of those days, thankfully. And I leaned forward and I said, Madam President, would you mind expanding on that question? And she says, well, I hear a rumor that you are mentoring dyslexics on your lunch hour. Is this true? Well, my blood pressure dropped considerably. And I thought, I've got my job for another day. And she said, tell me about it. And so we started this conversation, much like you have asked me to talk about today. And fast forward, and that led to a lot of different opportunities. And we started working with grants. And she said, here's some things that I think you might not know about that you should consider applying for, right? And funding in these areas. And we were competitive with everybody else, right? So there was no preferential treatment, but I just didn't know about these opportunities. And she laid out 2 or 3 opportunities that weren't even on my radar. And that's how I met Dr. Pennington. We put together the proposal for the first Dyslexia and Innovation Symposium. And we basically got a startup grant for that and proof of concept. And it was so well received that we were able to go back and get funding for more. And largely the funding, what it did is it allowed us to host a national level conference with 0 fee, right? So the participants, we wanted to create access. And that's one of the key mission statements of a land grant university is access. And so by eliminating even a modest fee to register for the Dyslexia Symposium, we could get all income levels, we could get students, we could get parents, we could get educators, we could get administrators. So there was no financial barrier. And so just a huge, and that was through what's called a Haas grant. And just a huge shout out to the Haas grant people, because that allowed us to build it into what it is today. And it was definitely a grassroots movement, right? We didn't know that we were going to triple participation every year. I mean, that's dynamic growth. And that what that means to us is that there's a hunger for this information. There's a hunger for this conversation. And it's not a me project, it's a we project. And it's us. And so we've had a really great group of people. We have an advisory board that kind of gives us direction. And then we have a council of 12, which are our boots on the ground, our local people that help pull this thing off. And they're just heroes. Every one of them is a hero in my mind. So that's how the conference got started. And
And Jeff, what's the mission of the conference? Because you have some interesting presentations. Tell us a little bit about what the conference looks like. Who's invited? Who speaks?
Well, the mission of the conference is to spotlight the strengths of the dyslexic mind, right? There's already a lot of conferences out there that are really well organized that deal with reading and reading systems and educating teachers.
I go to a lot of them every year.
Right. And those are wonderful. Those are wonderful. We wanted to create something new. We wanted to blaze a new trail, right? And Montana, it's kind of easy to do that. We just do it every day naturally. We get up, and whether it's shoveling our car out from the snow to get to work, we literally break trail every day. And so to come up with a conference idea that really no one in the US was doing, it was just kind of in sync with the Montana ethic of make something out of nothing, and then also improvise. And so the conference itself brings together, eclectic's not quite the right word, but I would say an unexpected user group. And so we bring We bring people that are successful dyslexics. We bring educators. We bring athletes. We bring published authors. We bring children's book authors. We bring practitioners, and we bring them all together. And we say, let's talk about their strengths. Let's have a new conversation. And then also at the same time, and this is really important, let's make a new list of successful dyslexics, right? So if you Google successful dyslexics or famous dyslexics, you'll get this list that is antiquated, right? And 50% of those people are no longer on the planet. They had great lives, good on them, but my kids don't know who these people are, right? And so we are trying to create a new 21st century list of powerful dyslexics, like Lindsay Dyer. Lindsay Dyer is, she's a big mountain pro athlete, right? And she lives in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And she helped kickstart the first all-female ski film in the history of that industry. She's sponsored by small companies like GoPro and Eddie Bauer and Jackson Resort, right? And she's out there killing it, right? And she got up for the very first time and spoke publicly about growing up dyslexic, right? And she was so brave. I mean, here's somebody that jumps off 60-foot cliffs. And here's somebody that, has skied some of the most insane lines in North America. But she was more nervous standing in front of a few hundred people talking about dyslexia than jumping out of a helicopter. So we need to change this conversation. And she just did a wonderful job. Another great person that was in our inaugural symposium was Cliff Weitzman. And Cliff is, he's an inventor, an entrepreneur who went to Brown University. He's kind of a serial entrepreneur. I think while he was an undergraduate, he developed 40 different business ideas. And the one that caught fire is the one that we know now called Speechify. And Speechify is this really powerful app. If you don't have it on your phone, you need to get it. And what it does is it can take a picture with your phone and it can ear read you any information. And so this is a game changer. I mean, I wish I would have had this in undergraduate. It would have, to transform that information from eye reading to ear reading. And now, Speechify has just exploded, right? And so he was one of our keynotes. I'll tell you a little side story. So when he was here in Bozeman, my son put Speechify on our phone, right? And we're driving out to the airport to pick him up, and my son's like taking pictures of the highway signs, and he says, tell Cliff that somewhere around 65 miles an hour, his app doesn't really work. And I said, I don't know that anybody's going to be really reading at 65 miles an hour, but we'll put it into R&D for that.
I love that.
Yeah.
Jeff. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Jeff, I was just going to say, my husband, that's how he gets through museums, is using Speechify. He loves a museum now. Hated them before, but now doesn't mind at all.
Well, it's this idea, and these terms need to be integrated into our future, which is the difference between eye reading and ear reading.
Yeah.
And especially in education, over the last 50 years, at least when I was going through, there was a discounting of listening to things as a way to access information.
Yep.
Oh, you didn't really read it.
I've heard it.
And I've heard that 1,000 times. And we just need to pivot on that. Yep. Because all the research has come in, and it is 100% clear that it doesn't matter if you're dyslexic or not. If you hear it rather than eye read it, you're going to remember it better. And I'm just going to put this out there. This is why professors still have jobs standing in front of a classroom, explaining it verbally as they demonstrate it, right? Is because this combination of ear reading and eye reading is what leads us to understanding. And please, as a parent, as a person, as an educator, please do not discount one over the other. Embrace them both and leverage them. I mean, in graduate school, I didn't know I was dyslexic yet. And so in graduate school, if you walked into my apartment in graduate school, there was three things in my apartment. There was a table to eat at, there was a chair to read at, and there was a bed. I'm not joking. It was that austere. In my first year of graduate school, I'm really proud to say I read 70 books. I'd never read that many books in my life, but I would not literally go to the university library, and we had a wonderful university library. And I had one of those flight attendant bags, and I would check out as many books as I can, and then I would just put them by my chair at night. And I wish Cliff had Speechify then, because I could have read 200 books that year. I mean, I maybe even could have read more, but I read 70. And as a dyslexic who to consume one eye-reading book a year was, I would call that arduous. So maybe up until that time, I had maybe read, other than textbooks, maybe I'd read 20 books for pleasure reading. I read 70, and it made me understand the difference between eye reading and ear reading.
Yeah. That's so interesting, Jeff. I remember as a parent having to defend my son's right to be able to listen to books. And he had an extensive vocabulary by the time he was just second grade because he had listened to so many books, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's terrific to emphasize. Jeff, you have taken us on a fantastic journey, and I hope for those listening that they have picked up on some really great pieces that you've left for all of us. And I want to remind folks, too, who maybe weren't listening about the conference piece, that the level of your conference, Jeff, is such that educators who participate can get credit as educators, too, for participating, right?
Absolutely. Sarah Pennington set that up, that they can get continuing education credits. And just a shameless self-promotion. You can find that at www.montana/DXI. And so we tried to make that address very simple. And you'll find out the articles, some of the articles that I've talked about Lindsay Dyer and Cliff are on there, as well as other amazing people like Linda Siegel, who's an educator out of Canada that wrote Not Stupid, Not Lazy. And then we will be having a whole bunch of new articles coming out over the next few months that include one about David Flink, who wrote Thinking Differently. And he's the founder of Eye to Eye, which is an amazing mentorship program that brings like 15 college students, dyslexic college students, into a high school or middle school setting through mentorship, through art projects. And then also two of my favorite people on the planet are Brock and Fernette Eide out of Seattle. And these two are just total game changers, heroes in my book. And they wrote The Dyslexic Advantage. And that's a great read for any parent, any educator, any dyslexic. And it's available on Audible as well. And they have a brand new version that they just did an update that came out just in the past few months.
Yeah, that's terrific. I love hearing about that. Okay, so Jeff, for our listeners, and at some time we do have to stop having this conversation. I think it's fantastic. I could do it all day. But what are some thoughts that you want to leave with? And let's just kind of picture there's an individual who has dyslexia, and maybe the parent is listening in on this conversation. Maybe there's a teacher listening in, and they're aware of this student or the young person in their life who does have dyslexia, who's saying, I don't know, it's pretty difficult. I can't see myself in college because it's so hard. What's some advice that you would recommend for them to help that person?
The future is super powerful. I mean, I never envisioned myself as a college professor. I'm also a motorsports photographer. I worked for Hot Rod Magazine for 15 years, traveled North America and Europe, photographing for the Corvette factory team for Corvette Magazine. I had no idea one of my strengths, because of my added peripheral vision, was action photography, right? And so sitting as a middle schooler, I didn't even know it was a career path, right? In a little rural town in Idaho. I didn't know the creative industry, being an art director, was even a career path. I didn't know that any of this was possible, right? And so I would just encourage, one is find that level of encouragement that supports the strengths, right? You have to navigate the weaknesses, right? Grammarly, man, if you don't have Grammarly on your computer and your phone and everywhere, every dyslexic should have that. That's just essential equipment, right? Because when I write an email to my president at the university, I do care about spelling, right? Because that communicates a tone. And so I always keep it in Grammarly before I send it out. But once again, I still can't spell entrepreneurship, but you and I can sit here and have another podcast for the next 2.5 hours about startup entrepreneurship. Spelling is not always linked to understanding. It is linked to communication, and it is linked to several other things, but it's not inherently connected to understanding. And so we need to know that. And also true, like, so my name's Jeffrey, right? And J is the youngest letter of the alphabet. So it's only about 500 years old, right? So we have to understand that this written language was made by humans, right? It was created by humans, and decoding was created. And when we look at the alphabet, there's 26 letters now. We make 44 sounds out of our mouth with those letters. But we teach our children over 250 different letter combinations to make those 44 sounds. Okay? So just do the quick math. We actually should have an alphabet of 44 letters, right? And that would make this whole thing way simpler. We'll get there, right? But realize that it's a complex problem to begin with. 26 letters, 44 sounds, over 250 combinations to make those 44 sounds. And I don't know, learning a foreign language by eye reading it is always going to be just challenging for a dyslexic, always. Hearing it, maybe being immersed in that culture, you're going to learn it because you've got the picture, you've got the object, you've got the sound, you've got the meaning all in one. So I don't know. I think just realizing what your strengths are, what you're good at, and then investing. And that's schooling in the traditional thing. Maybe it's mentorship, maybe it's internships, maybe it's private lessons, maybe it's just going out and playing in nature, right? It can be that simple, or getting a hang glider, right? Or finding something that you're really good at. But pay attention to where the skills are as much as where the skills aren't. And sign up for our conference, right?
Your conference, I'm going to plug that too, because when I got online and looked at all the background, it looked fantastic. I'm excited about it. Jeff, this has been such a fun conversation. Thank you so much. You're so generous of spirit and thought and energy, and I sure appreciate it. I know our listeners do too. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's been great to have this talk. Thank you.
You bet.
Thanks for joining us today. Literacy Talks comes to you from Reading Horizons, where reading momentum begins. Visit readinghorizons.com/literacy talks to access episodes and resources to support your journey in the science of reading.